Joining me now is Doug Brooks. He's the founder of International Stability Operations Association, supporting professionalism, standards, and advocating more effective application by the international community. He spent a lot of time in Ukraine and has great knowledge of the conflict going on there. He joins me from Las Vegas at the moment. Doug, thank you for joining me on the program today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
What do you make of the dimensions that the war has taken? Russia had initially said its target was just Ukrainian infrastructure, but now with more attacks on residential buildings, the death toll is rising.
So whatever Russia actually says, I mean, this was really a Putin decision to invade Ukraine, and it really was about changing the regime in Ukraine. I think Russia was not happy having a democratic nation on their border. The sort of idea that that kind of democracy could poison Russia and create a desire for the same sorts of standards and freedoms that they had in Ukraine. And so this was the real threat to Putin, whatever else he says.
And Russian forces also reportedly hit a military base near the border of Poland on Sunday. Would this be considered an attack on NATO?
It would not. And to be frank, NATO is going to do all it can to not get into a conflict with Russia. I mean, Russia is it is a nuclear power. Some people call it a gas station with nuclear weapons. It is not raising the risk to the entire world by having a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is probably worth avoiding. So yes, they may hit close to the border, but NATO is going to, I think, be pretty clear that they're not going to get involved unless the Russians literally cross the border or start shooting across the border.
Do you think Russia wants NATO to be involved in this war, NATO and the United States?
Well, NATO and the United States are involved in the war. Obviously, they're shipping weapons. They've been doing training for the Ukrainian military, excellent training for ever since 2014. So a direct confrontation with Russia, I think Russia does not want to see that. Just to put this in perspective, Germany has just decided to increase its defense spending by 25%, so 1/4. That 25% is the equivalent of the entire Russian military budget. And that's just one out of 30 countries in NATO. And a lot of countries are increasing their military budget. So I think Russia definitely does not want to have a direct confrontation with NATO any more than NATO wants to confront Russia.
Many have wondered, Doug, if Russia would find some excuse to introduce chemical weapons into this war. What would be the consequences of that?
I think that would be terrible for everybody. Certainly the U.S., who has been very open with their intelligence, has been saying that the Russians are toying with this idea of using chemical weapons. I think it would be a disaster for everybody. The U.S. and the West has basically said this would be a red line for them. This is something that should not be done. There's a lot of reasons from a tactical perspective that you don't use chemical weapons. It's hard to understand why the Russians would in this particular case, unless unless Putin, I should say, is simply in it for vengeance. But I sincerely hope, and I think everybody sincerely hopes, that the Russians do not take that step.
Now, speaking of Putin, I'm glad you mentioned him. He's promised, sometime last week, he said that the worst is yet to come in this war. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, he's probably right. The war has, I think the Russians have been very disappointed by the results so far. They've not been able to take Kiev, the capital in Ukraine. They've not been able to take any of the large cities. And the resistance from the Ukrainians, I think, has astonished the Russians. Also, the Russians have found out that their military is not nearly as professional as they thought. So this has been very, very bad for them. And their alternatives at this point are to withdraw or to negotiate a withdrawal, or perhaps become more brutal. And some sources are saying that they're running out of their guided weapons or guided munitions, meaning that the weapons they'll have less are going to be the more area effect, which is to say these multiple rocket launchers and so on. Essentially, you're not aiming at a target specific target so much as an area, which could be very well a city, as we've seen in some of the videos coming out of the conflict. So yes, it could become much, much more brutal. We hope that does not go there. The Russian military is feeling this one. It's not going well, and the hope is that maybe saner heads will prevail in Russia, and they will come up with a better solution than simply brutalizing their neighbor.
How do you think this war or conflict, as you prefer to call it, will end?
So there are several possible scenarios. President Putin has really, I think, annoyed, undermined some of the richest people in Russia that have been supporting him. A lot of the Russian population has been tolerant of Putin in the sense that if they're not being oppressed, then they are tolerating him and allowing him a lot of leeway in terms of his external adventures in Georgia and then also in the Crimea and so on. I think there's going to be a lot of pushback on that. And I think it is entirely possible that we could see regime change in Russia, and it could be peaceful or it could be something else. So that's one possibility. Another possibility, I think we've seen not total defeat of the Russian military, but it's in very bad shape right now, and it's likely to get worse for the Russians. They may be militarily forced back even beyond the borders that they had from 2014. That's possible. But ultimately what will probably end the conflict, at least in the short term, is going to be some sort of negotiated peace. And most likely at this point, it seems like the Russians will have to retreat back to the 2014 lines that they had, possibly even more. But we'll have to see. And lots of events are still coming together, and it's quite possible the Ukrainians could start their own counteroffensive in the next week or so, and we might actually see the Russian military forced back. So it's going to be an interesting time.
Todd Brooks, thank you for speaking with me. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you on Diplomatic Channel.
The honor is mine.